Good afternoon. My name is Natalia Wallen. I'm the co-founder of the Vitality Fund, focused on nature-based solutions, currently working across sectors and disciplines to build up early-stage investment opportunities. I am also a long-distance mountain runner. So everything about this conversation about elevating nature is really significant to me, both personally and professionally, and I'm excited for the conversation we're going to have today with our incredible panelists up here. I think for so many of us, it's easy for us on a daily basis to think of nature as something separate from us. It's outside there, it's a holiday, or it's something that we harness and extract from. But of course, the reality is that biodiversity is responsible for our food, our soil, our water, and if phytoplankton communities in the ocean collapse, we stop breathing, and our investments are worth nothing. So let's get real today when we talk about elevating nature, biodiversity, what regeneration actually looks like. And this group of experts has a lot of insights into what tangible solutions actually look like. So we're going to really dig into that today, and we're going to hear from them about sort of their big picture vision and objectives for their work, as well as how we measure progress and what scale looks like. So let's get started with a round of introductions. I'm going to ask each of the speakers to introduce a little bit about themselves and their work, and then we will dive into the conversation. So Excel, you get us started?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Axel Ducos, and I'm the Chief Growth Officer for LandLife, a nature tech company. LandLife does basically high integrity nature restoration, and we work on bringing back very degraded land into a thriving natural forest ecosystem. LandLife is 10 years old, so we've done hundreds of projects around the world. But today we work in 5 hubs primarily. We work in Europe, in Spain, in Portugal. We work in the US and Canada on the northwest. We work in Australia, and then we work in Indonesia and in Mexico. And I'm super happy to be with you here today to discuss biodiversity.
Hi, thanks everybody. My name's Rob Waterworth. I'm the Chief Science and Innovation Officer at Flint Pro. Flint Pro is a system that if you need to know something about your land, you can come to us and we can tell you about it. So if it's about carbon, if it's about biodiversity, what's happened in the past, what options you might have in the future, we have an advanced modelling framework that allows you to integrate multiple data streams together to start answering those questions. I've worked in this, a bit of background, for quite a long time now, I guess, and someone very kindly earlier pointed out that I'd started working in it last century, which is unbelievably disturbing, so I'm going to stop there.
Good afternoon. My name is Pain Mako from Tanzania. We work with pastoralists, hunters and gatherers communities in the northern part of Tanzania. And what we really do is to secure land tenure for pastoralists and hunter-gatherers communities. And we don't look at individual titling, we look at collective titling for these groups, because their life is all about collective ownership, collective management, and collective protection of land and natural resources. So that's me, and I'm very happy to be with you this afternoon. Thank you.
Hi everybody, my name's Glenn and I work for RSPB, which is the UK's largest nature charity, on a large upland reserve in Cumbria in the Lake District National Park called Wild Haweswater. Wild Haweswater is a partnership project between RSPB, who manages the land, and also United Utilities, who's the owner of the land and the catchment that we're working on around Haweswater itself, which is a huge reservoir Really important for United Utilities, supplies around 2 million people in the north of England with their drinking water. So the partnership's about, for RSPB, primarily about restoring nature, restoring natural processes, rewilding essentially. For United Utilities, it's about trying to improve water quality before it reaches the reservoir, because obviously that makes it a bit more cost effective for them. But also there's a whole host of other really nice sort of public benefits in terms of storing carbon, slowing the flow in terms of trying to prevent flooding further downstream, which we do get a bit of that. I've had that in the past. And also, obviously, most important thing for us is restoring biodiversity and creating some really nature-rich habitats. So I'm actually from Cumbria, very near to where I work now, and I haven't always worked there, so it is a real delight for me to be working back in my landscape and helping to restore that. So, yeah, it's a real dream job.
Great, thank you. So I thought just to kick off our discussion today, what I'd love to hear from all of you is that we'd sort of start with kind of the big picture before we really get into the nitty-gritty of measurement and how we assess the work and what scale would look like. So if we could just talk for a minute about, as each of you reflect on your work and your areas of expertise, how would you define success in your space? What does kind of the impact that you're looking for, what would that look like if your work was successful? Can you paint a picture for us? And Excel, why don't we start with you? Because I know you work globally across a few different continents on climate mitigation and ecosystem revitalization. So maybe you could give us a sense of the big picture first, and then I'd ask everybody to jump in and share from their perspective.
Yeah, of course. I will start maybe by telling you about what is the primary KPI we have in our organization, which is the number of hectares degraded that we restore back. That is the main indicator that we follow, and this is where we want to have a big impact. To give a sense of magnitude, there are about 2 billion hectares of degraded land, and every year it is getting worse. So you have the deforestation that I think everyone knows about, but you also know there are some wildfires that are really devastating. A number of forests traditionally can withstand some fire, but the fires we're experiencing these days are really truly devastating. Nature doesn't really come back after. You also have maybe some over-farming, which over the years has meant that the soil is depleted and the land is just not productive, not useful anymore. So this is what we see, and this is what we want to change. Something you said at the start, which is, nature is so important, and this is absolutely true, and something that sometimes not everyone fully recognizes. Now, I think we all here can agree that nature has value in and out of itself, but I think when we look also, this is really the core, the basis of our economic system. The World Economic Forum, I think in 2019, did an analysis, and they concluded that about 50% of the world GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature, which means that if nature and the ecosystems it provides stop, immediately 50% of the GDP will start not working anymore. And that's just a direct one. So as you said, food, beverages, but also pulp, wood, but also pharmaceutical, cosmetics. So sometimes we forget a little bit of that. So our goal and what we do is to really look at those hectares. We have this map, and this is what we want to address. This is what matters for us, to bring back not only capturing carbon, but really bring back an ecosystem that brings the biodiversity back, that has an impact on water, on soil, and that enables really a thriving ecosystem to come back.
Fantastic. And Payne, if you want to maybe come in on this point, I know we were talking a little bit earlier about the work that you're doing around land management. Would you share a little bit about your perspective on the work?
Sure. So in 2022, my family and 70,000 other Maasais lost 1,500 square kilometers of land to investment or hunting company concessions. And so that was in 2022. But over the years in the past, we've lost a lot of land. And so did other communities, other pastoral and hunter-gatherers community, because they've really maintained land. They've left it natural, open, and accessible to all community members. So generally, we came into the picture to try and reduce the rate at which we were losing land. And so over the years, it was really, really hard to implement this because people and our decision makers did not understand the concept of collective ownership. So we came into the picture to try and put that in place, legal collective ownership titles. And so it took us 10 years to implement the first ever communal title in Tanzania. And after 10 years, we managed to do that and were able to replicate and work around 3 different distinct landscapes on collective titling, ensuring that these land titles are connected to each other to allow collective ownership, collective sharing of resources by communities.
It's incredible. So yeah, Rob and Glenn, do you guys want to come in a little bit in terms of, what does it look like? What's kind of your vision and objectives in the spaces that you work in particular?
Yeah, I think for us, sometimes I think of the acronym BBC, bigger, better, more connected. So when we're thinking about restoring landscapes for nature, really you're trying to think about what's the quality of the stuff that you've already got, and it's really important to protect that. Can you make it bigger? Can you extend it? But also, habitats have become quite fragmented, especially in nature-depleted countries like the UK. So you might have these little pockets of amazing habitat with wildlife and opportunities, but actually they're so disparate from each other that actually, you start to lose species at quite a rate. So even just looking at those opportunities for connecting those habitats between, whether it's planting some hedges or little strips of woodland, or thinking about how wetlands connect through to each other and how animals and birds and other biodiversity can move through the landscape, I think that's really important. I think in terms of the reserve that I manage, it's really about thinking about having a really nice mosaic of habitats, so it doesn't have to be one thing or another, thinking about how they blend into each other and just providing loads of different opportunities for different species. I mean, that's brilliant for wildlife, but it also, when you've got more trees and more scrub in the landscape, it's really good at preventing water from whooshing down into the watercourses and down into the rivers and flooding cities like Carlisle, which is our nearest city, which has happened quite a few times in the last decade or so. But also thinking about where we can restore other natural processes like peatlands, which have often been degraded through drainage or overgrazing through intensive agriculture. So it's all of those things. It's almost thinking about what are the basic building blocks of restoring the ecosystems, which is what I think of as restoring natural processes, or maybe termed as rewilding. And then if you can get that right, I think a lot of the other things kind of fall into place quite naturally. So that would be my perspective.
Rob, did you have any thoughts to jump in with here?
Oh, sure. I mean, from our side, the impact is really supporting all of this. To understand the past impact that we've had on different landscapes, to then be able to understand what are our opportunities going forward, what can we actually do to change the way our management practices are influencing the land and nature. And as you've pointed, there's multiple pathways to that. And so you need to have systems that can actually help you make those decisions across the landscape. And for me, that's where I'm hoping our impact will be, is helping organisations and people make those better decisions much more easily, and just as part of everyday decision making, it will be coming through. It won't be something that's off to the side, which has caused many of the problems that we're seeing now.
I think that's a perfect segue to kind of the next question, which, Rob, I'll actually ask you, since you are the guru on all things data and measurement. I think it'd be really helpful to get your perspective on sort of what are the key metrics and sort of data sources that you think are really important for assessing progress. I know we hear a lot about carbon in particular, but you focus on really integrating multiple data streams. So could you kind of help us understand the various data streams that come into play, and how you sort of look at what that means for assessing progress going forward?
Certainly. I think one of the most interesting parts of working in this area is because nature is inherently complicated. Everything when we're trying to come up with metrics and measurements it means that it's complicated, and we can't represent all of that complication, but we can represent it well enough to be really able to come up with sensible decision processes. So I think from my side, the first thing to remember, and you really came beautifully into the question you asked then, was there isn't a silver bullet in this space. And I think that's the most important thing to recognise. There isn't going to be a single satellite or a single model or a single piece of ground data or something that's going to solve this issue. All of these have a really useful place. And the challenge then comes, how do you integrate them? How do you integrate all of these different systems and all of these different data streams coherently? So rather than thinking about individual data streams as such, and because there's so many, even if you talk about satellites, if you look at the sheer volume of different satellite data these days, we could spend 5 hours sitting here talking about it and probably not really progressing much on improving nature, but we'd have a fascinating data discussion. It's really about, from my side, a few key things. It's making sure that the data is meeting the need. So very often we like pretty pictures. Very often we like to see a number, but what does that number mean? And more importantly, how do we use that number and how do we use this data, as we were pointing out before, to make these better decisions? So to me, that's the key piece of the puzzle. And depending on where you are in the world and what you're looking at, it's likely to be a different data stream every single time, because the world is beautifully diverse, would be a nice way of putting it. And that's what we're trying to get back to. So I think that's probably my main summary is it's thinking about what we want, and too often we look for technical solutions rather than looking for the actual policy need. And if we focus very first on what's our need, what do our systems need to deliver us to make better decisions, the data requirements will flow from that. And that's a very key lesson from working too long in this.
No, I think that's really important. I'd love to come back to that later then, as we think about sort of how would you ideally shape those conversations in the future? Because it does get challenging, right? Especially for investors. I think looking at where should they be investing their money and what metrics and KPIs are they looking at, I know that becomes very challenging. So I'd love to hear more. Let's get into some of those data streams in a minute. And Payne, I actually would love to hear your thoughts on this question of sort of how you see in your work sort of the metrics that matter most in the work that you're doing, and maybe some of the challenges around that. I know we were talking a little bit about some of the challenges that you're seeing around how you sort of measure or report impact, and what data really matters to you. So we'd love to hear about that.
So initially in our organization, in our communities, the focus was really the work on the ground. We really never thought much about data and collecting information to share it out. But of course, over time we realized, and people kept saying that data matters. And so we started collecting the data of the land size people have, and that is really critical because communities understand and know how much land is under their ownership and how much they can invest in the huge landscape. And it helps them to collaborate and work together to manage the land that is under them. You cannot manage or take care of something that you don't own. So really the land size is a big agenda for us, but we are also looking into the management and governance, looking at when we do the rotational grazing plans and practices, we look at grass size, the amount of invasive species in the landscape, the presence of bare land. All these help us to make decisions on how we develop planning management schemes within the communities.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate how much nuance and thought goes into that, along with Rob's comments about the complexities of nature, that it's often, there is no silver bullet, right? So that's really interesting. And Glenn, I know you had just touched on it, I think in your opening introduction to your work, But can you say a little bit, when you think about how the work is assessed, how you measure progress, you'd made a few comments about kind of the public benefits, various benefits that go hand in hand with, say, like one particular KPI or metric. Could you say a little bit about kind of what the holistic picture is for you on what progress looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it depends what objectives you're looking at. But I think for us and for RSPB, they've always really seen the value in data and monitoring. And I think one of the most important things as well is to look at baseline data, so really know what you're starting with, because if you don't take the time and the effort to gather that baseline data to see what the habitats look like, see what species are there, then you really can't start to report on any of the successes or changes that you're going to see over a period of time. And often it takes decades really to see significant change, especially when you're working in the English uplands, because trees grow really slowly, for instance. So I think you can't overestimate how important that baseline data is for any project, just to really know what your starting point is, because you can't go back and do that once you're 10 years into a project. So I think that's really important. And also what's increasingly important, I think, is for us as an organisation, not just thinking about biodiversity, but thinking, how much carbon are we storing? How can we assess that? Do we know what our carbon stocks are already? Because there are quite a lot of companies out there now who are sort of sniffing around and see the value in carbon and want to invest in it. And in fact, we've got a private investor at the moment who's really, really interested in putting a significant amount of money into one of the reserves near to where I work. And that's very much about the carbon stocks that are there in the peatlands. So if we don't know that data, we're not really able to kind of make those decisions about whether that's good investment or whether whether that's money that we can get into the organisation that otherwise we just wouldn't have access to. So you can't really overestimate, I think, how important data is in terms of thinking about us financing nature recovery, but also just understanding when something's working or not working. It might be certain species of bird. If you're monitoring it, you start from a very low baseline, and after 12 years you've got 200% increase. So that's really good at trying to explain and get support for the changes as well.
Yeah, baseline's definitely important. And Excel, I know in a previous conversation, I think you and Rob and others were making some comments about how a lot of times people are looking at something like tree counts, right? Looking at success as being, or measuring progress as how many trees exactly are planted. But can you expound a little bit on sort of what would you like to see in terms of how we're assessing success and metrics made toward progress, maybe besides the sort of simple solutions that we think of?
Yeah, no, a great question. So we use data in three main ways, and one of them is what you mentioned. The first one is to help us do the best planting we can, right? So that the survival of the forest will be the best, because at the end of the day, we want to restore an ecosystem. So we use a lot of data, some of them from satellites, some of them on the ground, to understand what the landscape is, and so what we can plant where. We're trying to we only plant native species, but we also try, of course, to do a mix of diverse species, and you want to be smart about where you're planting them, where there is sand, where there is different type of soil. So we do a lot of analysis before the planting to understand where to plant what, so that we can have the most successful survival rate. And the first couple of years of a forest are usually the most vulnerable ones, the first 4 years. So you really want at that moment to give the best chance of survival and of resilience to the forest. Then we monitor, of course, to see, and sometimes everything has gone really well, and sometimes we see that some things didn't take very well, so we come back the following year and we replant where we need to. So data is really critical for us to do the restoration work. Then the second set of data we use is actually the projection around carbon sequestration, because we finance the restoration work via the voluntary carbon market. So the corporates which invest in the restoration work, they don't buy the land, but they invest in the credit rights that are going to come of the growing forest. Of course, they want to understand how many units of carbon they can expect to have this. So we have developed a lot of data and modeling to understand where and how much we will sequester in the different type of forest and different location. And then the latest set of data that we're working with, we're very excited about because this is around biodiversity. Now, when you restore, as I was telling you, our goal is not, to maximize the carbon, because that can lead you to making very bad planting decisions. You might be planting a monoculture that will be, great at capturing a lot of carbon, but will actually be disastrous for the ecosystem. So we've always planted those diverse forests with the goal of biodiversity in mind, and we could show to people, look, here are traces of a bear, or look, there was a wolf. That's very exciting, but it was not very data driven. So for people it was a little bit nice, but they were not sure what really it meant. So now we're starting to really do baselining on biodiversity, and so we are setting up the different metrics, and depending on where we plant, right, the metrics and the tools might not be the same that we use in Australia or that we use in Spain, for example. But there are great technology development with bioacoustics, with eDNA, that now give us a lot more data, right, to say, okay, this is where we're starting from, and now we will be able to measure, the biodiversity improvement and progress we're making with, I guess, more data than just pictures of a bow in the sand. So we hope that this will give more confidence to people in understanding that the work is bringing back the biodiversity, that they will value it more, and that they will be willing to finance it more.
So interesting and so important. And I think what this really kind of brings me to, as I'm listening to all of you talk, it sounds like, okay, there's a lot of complexity, right? In the natural world, there's a lot of nuance to really understanding biodiversity, understanding the specific context in which you are looking to restore an ecosystem. So I think, in some ways, the challenge for me, right, that comes to mind is, so if I'm an investor or a business owner, or in some other way want to be involved in this space, what kind of actions, investment, partnerships are really needed to scale up this kind of work? I know there have been calls from some sources for something around 11 trillion US dollars in nature-based solutions by 2050. So how would you see us sort of taking the next steps to getting to scale, given the fact that there really is so much nuance? There's a lot of questions around time horizons for investments, and the various data streams that need to go into it. So this is it's a big question, but I'm hoping you guys can each take a stab at it. So I don't know, Glenn, do you want to start on this one?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of interest in land at the moment, especially from my perspective in the UK. There's a lot of competition for land, whether that's from agriculture, whether it's for building, whether it's for shooting, which is is an activity in the uplands that takes quite a lot of space, grouse shooting. So there's all of these different sort of competing elements, and I think now we've got the other competing element is companies that are interested in kind of nature-based solutions or carbon, for instance. So there was a big chunk of land came up for sale recently near to the reserve where I work, and normally there just wouldn't have been that much interest because it's not brilliant agricultural land, but actually there was loads of interest because there was a lot of companies that were speculating on the basis of being able to restore peatlands, plant loads of trees, and kind of thinking about it as an investment, which is something quite new, really, I think, from our perspective. So I think that's making things a bit challenging at times, and I think it can also mean that you're getting, these companies have the money and they maybe got the investment, but they don't have the expertise in really knowing the kind of understanding the nuance around land management or right trees in the right places, or where you shouldn't plant any trees, for instance, in wetlands and things like that. So I think one of the best things that we can do to kind of encourage companies like that to get into this space is more to create partnerships with organisations like, RSPB, for instance, or other organisations who have a track history of restoring habitats and understand it and have the people on the ground. So it's almost like maybe putting the investment in the organisations who've been doing that for a long time and who actually have that expertise as well, rather than coming in, buying a chunk of land, thinking they know what they're going to do with it, alienating the community, and just not really knowing what direction to take it once they've acquired it. So I think we're seeing a lot of that at the moment, and I'm not quite sure how that's going to end up, but it doesn't work very well, I would say.
Payne, I know you have some thoughts on what partnerships with local organizations should look like.
So I come from, and I agree with you, there is a lot of competing interest around land. We, back in Tanzania, face a lot of pressure from conservation, expansion of national parks. Carbon is this huge pressure, and our top priority right now is to secure as much as we can of what is left of collective lands. So that's our top priority. But now with the pressure from carbon, communities are a bit confused on what's going on globally and what are the needs on the ground. So right now, the top priority to secure land because of the pressure communities are facing. A lot of evictions are going on because of competing interests. And so priorities can be really different depending on the context. And for our survival, for community survival, legal tenure, collective tenure is the top priority. And I think investment comes second.
Can just building on that just a little bit, when you say investment comes second, I mean, what are kind of the stages of investment, or what kinds of resources do you actually need to do the work? So I know some of it is grant funding and then maybe philanthropic, but do you see there sort of being a natural sequence that's going to be important for you to be able to expand the work?
So there are different ways in which different people can support, scale up the work we do. First is recognition that approaches that we use from the ground level work. And I think what we need, the kind of support we need, is for whoever is interested to financially support or invest on the land is to understand the cultural context of our local communities and start from there. Introducing something new creates chaos and a state of confusion and leads to eviction, which is what is now happening. Forthright conservation is not something that is functional, is not sustainable. And our communities are showing the way that, we own, we manage as a community. It's sustainable because, these communities give the labor that is required to sustain land and natural resources. And so let's all begin from there. Let us recognize the efforts that are being done on the ground level and move up.
Yeah, thanks. So important. Instead of it being a top-down kind of project, make sure we really understand what's happening on the ground. Rob, did you want to jump in on that?
Yes, look, it's an enormous and fascinating challenge, the scaling issue. But I'd come back I couldn't have said it even any better than that. Nature is about people. If you exclude people, then we're not going to be able to redo nature. It's as simple as that. And some of these concepts that have been applied in the past around we'll lock up this piece of land and we'll then harvest this piece of land and we'll chunk it into little pieces has largely failed. And so we really need to think through how we're doing that. I think from my side, the most interesting piece of scaling is just the level of collaborations that are going to be required all the way through. We're going to need really good government policy. We're going to need corporate governance and systems coming in across this, but everything, as was being pointed out already, is still going to have to come from the bottom up. It's going to have to come from the ground. And as we've said before, nature is extremely diverse. A type of tree planted in one area is a terrible tree to be planted in another. We also need to consider the the commercial aspects of this. We want to put some nature back in areas, certainly, but we probably also really want to think about things like, we do want to think about plantations, timber plantations. They're extremely effective at taking up carbon. They make some lovely timber products that mean we're using a lot less steel and concrete. That is an amazing climate change thing, but we can't let it march across an entire landscape. So how do we work through this entire chain from top to bottom to come up with sensible land use planning to get to this? And I think the other thing personally that I've seen hold back nature action a lot is fear of failure. Oh, what if we plant this and it dies? Oh, what if we try this and it doesn't work? And it's like, well, of course that's going to happen. But this is a new area for us. We're trying to restore things. We actually don't know how to restore a lot of these things properly. We're really trying it out. We will fail. We should actually encompass and embrace that. And when we take those failures, we go, wow, we learnt from that one. Let's go do the next one. And that's the only way we're going to reach scale, is a fail fast and try again across the landscape.
It's a very entrepreneurial mindset with, with that, it sounds like. But yeah, Excel, do you have any thoughts on kind of what does investment and partnership and action look like in this space, right? If you're a business leader, if you're an investor, a philanthropist, I mean, practically speaking, what does it look like to actually help scale this work? Because there's a lot of nuance in it. So I'm hearing a lot of really engage with local experts. But yeah, where would you start?
So everything that the co-panelists said is absolutely true. We'd say the same. You need to have the community, right? If a community is not happy with what you're planting, you also have the risk of them taking it down, right? Because it's annoying for their sheep, right? So you really need to work, whichever the context, whether you're in Spain or where you're in Tanzania, I think you need to work with the community. Now, I think maybe I'll throw in a couple of different things because I agree with everything they said, so I'll just add a few more things. I think regulation, indeed, is going to be incredibly important. So it's encouraging to see some regulation, for example, just from the EU, right, the CSRD, that will force people to start mapping out what their impact and what their vulnerability is in their whole value chain towards nature, toward biodiversity, right? So when people will start seeing where do I have material impact, I think that will already make probably a sobering effect for a number of organizations, but at least we will again start to have a baseline of this is where we are today. Then I think there will be, and I hope more and more recognition among corporations that we need to move towards net positive. Net zero is good, it's fine, but we need to move towards net positive, and that we it's not just about carbon, it's about also biodiversity and all the other elements. So the more we start to also explain and accept that complexity and accept that it's not going to be perfect, but that progress is what we need. We need to keep trying, keep doing. Otherwise, the alternative is not very exciting. And I think on our side, we also believe that there is a need for technology, right, to also help us at scale, to plan, to improve, to do things better. So I think all those different pieces, I want to be optimistic. I think all these different pieces are, showing promise and coming together, and that it is also for investors then a more understandable domain to invest in, and that you can have projections that make sense, that you can have data that is reliable, and that there will be security in that market, that the market will be solid, and that people will invest. And I think that will also help to propel us further. Because restoration, we need to say it, it's not cheap, right? Especially when the land has been very degraded. It needs to take some capital to do it well.
Yeah, so I think again, even back to all the different data streams that are needed to really make that case and make it really clear, I think it's really interesting. So I know here in just a minute, we'll open it up for questions from all of you. So I hope you've been thinking of questions for the panelists. And just before we do Q&A then, one other question that I kind of wanted to come back to, and this came out of a conversation with Glenn, but as you think about this space, what are some of the biggest maybe misconceptions that you would love to clear up, or areas of debate that you have found to be sort of not nuanced enough. So yeah, just kind of misconceptions. And I know, Glenn, you had some thoughts on rewilding and other things. I thought it'd be really helpful if you could share some of that.
Yeah, I think the rewilding term is quite emotive for a lot of people, and actually what it sort of conjures for a large part of society is wolves and bears, and just giving it up, moving people out and giving it over to nature, and it's just for nature and not for people, which in some ways is really not helpful. I think it is more nuanced than that, and I really see it as more of a sliding scale of restoring natural processes, rewilding at one end, I guess, right through to quite an intensively managed farm, but with some little areas for wildlife, or plant some new hedges, or dig in a pond. It can go, and everything and anything in between. So I think really when we're talking about rewilding, or depending on who you're talking to, sometimes it's useful not to use that term. Sometimes I often just refer to it as restoring natural processes, because even if I'm talking to farmers, they understand it, but it also doesn't provoke a kind of a reaction which sometimes isn't that favourable. So yeah, I would say that we've just got to be careful about kind of how we talk about restoring nature, and we've got to know our audience as well, which I think is really important, and even just in terms of the language that we use can be really important. So yeah, to me it's just a sliding scale, and I think if we think of it like that, it means that there's opportunities in every space to do something useful for nature.
Yeah, go ahead. Do you have thoughts on sort of misconceptions that you wish you could clear up if you could wave a magic wand and clear up certain terminology or debates that really kind of get in the way or impede progress in this space?
So there are local solutions to world problems. And I think we need to all go back to local solutions and build from there, work with people to get solutions to the problems we are all facing.
I've probably got way too many of them, but even from a very simple perspective, one of the ones that we've spoken about before, just really simple ways that people think. So you'll see a lot of, we planted this many trees. One of the misconceptions I dislike is around that. I don't really care how many trees you plant. What I care about is that you've brought back X hectares of an ecosystem. And if you plant 2,000 trees a hectare in year zero, a good ecosystem means that well over 3/4 of those should be dead by the time that forest is 100. That's a natural process. And so really thinking through this misconception of we're trying to do these little pieces into how we're actually trying to think about the systems we're trying to build. And that can get very confusing for people that aren't working in the space. So trying to break that down, I think, would help a lot, as an example.
Systems thinking is always harder anyway. Yeah, Excel.
Yeah, no, I will just build on what you're saying. I think this notion of, we planted so many trees, and sometimes on consumer facing, you see, €1 tree, right? And I think people can say, oh, well, then, we've given so many euros, isn't everything sorted? And you're like, well, not exactly, because did we plant the right tree? Was it done in the proper way, also with the community, so that you can create a nursery, so that the community can learn to rebuild, re-maintain, recreate those nurseries, the seedlings, etc. So there's also this notion that I think you see it sometimes, right? All of us as consumers just donate €1 for a tree, and the intention is really good, but I don't know that it's in a way ends up really making the impact that people are hoping. And I think in that sense, we probably need to help people understand, get more sophisticated in their understanding of what needs to take place. And a lot of us now are urban people, and I think we don't know that so well. So I think we need to do that job of better bringing the complexity to the narrative.
That's always challenging, right? And maybe that involves also some clear examples and case studies and some storytelling aspect of that to make it easier to grasp. But yeah, I know we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Julia. I thank you so much for the wonderful panel. I have a question to Alex. You mentioned that you have a need of technology in order to support revitalizing and rebuilding the ecosystem. I was just wondering what kind of technology exactly is needed in order to support it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the technology we are looking at right now is so there are a couple of things that we are considering. One is around tree planting. It remains a very manual effort today, and when we're thinking about planting millions of hectares, you wonder, is this the best way of doing it? Today there is some technology via drones, but it's not really successful. We don't use it. We don't find it in the places where we plant. Maybe in other ecosystem it works, but we don't see it working. So we are looking for ways of improving, planting technologies. I think there is also a lot of learning around how to help the soil to recover faster and better. So there is seed coating, there is preparation of the soil. I think there is we don't know as much about the soil as we should, as all of us together. So I think this is also a very interesting field of research and experimentation, because it's only by learning and doing and testing a few things that we'll see, here it works well for this soil, for this seed, and we proceed. I think those are two of the ones that we look at most.
Thanks a lot. Really engaging panel. Particularly for those engaged day to day in restoration, I want to hear about the human stories of when you know that it's working. So when you know a mind has changed, so you're all nodding, so I don't mind who answers this one, but each of you have clearly got a point at which you interacted with another human being and thought, yeah, what I'm doing is working, and I just want to hear a couple of those because I find them quite inspirational myself.
So in one of our landscapes, Simanjiro Plains in particular, it's an area where wildlife and people use the same land. But pastoralists understand that during a specific season, it's the breeding season for wildebeest. And so during the breeding season, they would move into a different area to allow the wildebeest to breed. And so there is that understanding between people and wildlife that we could coexist in a way that we use and share resources.
I'll maybe just give an example as well, because it's one that's kind of fresh in my mind. So at Wild Haweswater, one of the most controversial things that we've had to do is reduce sheep numbers. And actually we still have some sheep, and part of the reason is that was because of the cultural element of that, so that we still kind of have a seat at the table when we're talking about upland farming. But recently I was at a meeting with a local commoners association. So in the English uplands, there's areas that are kind of owned, or people have grazing rights over large areas of the Lake District. And they're, the Commoners Association, which has about 8 different farmers in it, is basically looking to get an agri-environment scheme through the government, so government grants. And they've come up with the idea of completely removing sheep from their area of the Lake District, which is just not something culturally that you'd normally expect to see. So it's just really interesting. I'm not suggesting that they've looked at what we're doing and decided that's inspirational, and some of it is to do with money. But even you could offer some farmers £1 million each and they still wouldn't do it because they're so linked to it culturally. And actually to be at that meeting the other day and to hear them talking about the fact that they're taking all of the sheep off, they're going to have cattle and ponies grazing that common instead, and actually do large-scale tree planting, just really, well, just about fell over with shock. But also just, it does show you that things are slowly moving, even for some of the kind of older generation of farmers. And that is largely based around being able to see it and understand what that looks like. So that's by looking across the wall and seeing what we're doing. But also the incentives have got to be there as well financially, I think, for that to happen.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it comes to both of those things. It's when people see change for the first time and how does that then scale. So one of my favourite ones, a small place in Armidale in Australia called Malpas Dam. Lots of land degradation, lots of land clearing, not a lot of trees left. In the late 80s, early 90s, there was an effort to start trying to regenerate some of these areas. A very small group of believers and mostly skeptics, to the point where, because they were trying to deal with erosion problems, the farmers were saying, well, yes, okay, plant some of your native species back there, but actually can you plant cotoneaster down the side of it? And that's a noxious weed in Australia. And that was because it grew fast and it held the soil together well enough. And it wasn't until that program started to take off and people went, oh, look, the native trees do grow. Oh, you can actually bring them back. We never thought you could bring those back. And suddenly it sparked this tree planting scheme that really took around an area that was suffering quite bad natural dieback. And so it was really just watching that space. And I think that's something that's going to have to happen much more rapidly somehow.
Hi. Really, I'm grateful to all the panelists. It is a quite insightful debate. My question to Glenn, the UK has recently introduced a law called BNG, that's the biodiversity net gain. So as Axel, she mentioned about the regulatory, so is that helping to expand the existing woodland? And basically it's a compensatory biodiversity, what you can say, the enhancement of plantation. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, it's still early days, really, I think, for BNG. Lots of people are very interested in it. And I think there's, in terms of the organisation that I work for, I think there's a couple of examples nationally where they've been able to have a couple of projects which have benefited from biodiversity net gain and have some investment into the reserves from that. I think it just seems there's a bit of waiting and watching just to see how that's going to develop and what it really means. And so I think there's a lot of potential, but I don't think that it's really taken off in a big way yet. But it is still really early days. So I think if there is some sort of successful projects where people can look at and say, yeah, that we could imagine doing that, or that would work for us, then it's probably a really good opportunity to get investments in nature conservation, I think, going forward. So I'm hopeful, but it's still really early days, I'd say.
Hi, Craig Burnett from Ashton. I just wondered if the panel could talk about the value of sustainable livelihoods in terms of regeneration and safeguarding biodiversity, and how important that is for sort of including and building relationships with local communities.
So I think for sustainability purposes, livelihoods have to be at the core of everything, really. So, and the key for the communities I come from is really to access grass throughout the year. That's critical, and that is the backbone of the economy. But again, there are efforts that we support the communities to add value or increase income from land and natural resources. We do community-based tourism, particularly cultural tourism, because the northern Tanzania landscape is a very popular tourist circuit. So taking advantage of that and supporting communities to leverage or get income from tourism through cultural tourism is something that has been very beneficial for them. But again, to have that, you have to have systems in place, a code of conduct between communities and tourists, and how they can interact with each other and set prices, standard prices that are comfortable for communities and tourists. So with that, they earn extra income that goes into supporting social services, building of schools, hospitals, or scholarship for students. I am a beneficiary of community income, so it works. And of course, carbon is coming in, extra income. There are a lot of challenges around carbon, but again, we see that as an opportunity as well.
I was just going to say, in a previous life, when I was working inside the Australian government, I worked across a lot of different sustainability, land sector sustainability programs across different countries, the vast majority of which failed absolutely dismally. Yes, there were some failures in the tree plantings and there were some failures in things. They all fell over because no one dealt with livelihoods and communities properly. That when you look back at it, that was just the most obvious lesson. That there was just a complete lack of engagement, and that meant that once the funding stopped, it all went back to where it was, and that was it. And that lesson has been learnt, unfortunately, time and time again, and hopefully we can stop that, because otherwise it's not going to work in the future.
Yeah, so when RSPB took over the tenancies of the 2 farms at Haweswater in 2012, there was probably a handful of people actually were employed on those farms. So the farmer, maybe some farm workers, a shepherd. And one of the criticism, I think, early days was that from the local communities that it's like land clearances. You get rid of these farms, you bringing in outsiders, you're giving it all over to nature, and that's obviously very upsetting, I think, for the local community when they perceive it to be that. Actually, I think what's happened over the last 12 years is that as the investment has grown within the reserves and within restoring biodiversity and restoring the habitats, that actually the number of people who now work at Wild Haweswater is over 20. So those are 20 people that are employed on those same 2 farms. There's been millions of pounds worth of investment into that area, and also it's really important to try and use local contractors, I think, to have people employed from the local village. We've got a good connection with the pub in the local village where we spot them, and when people come and visit, they stay in the pub. And so it's all about making those connections and working really hard to make that happen, because that's how you start to build inroads into the community and for them to start to support you. So it's making the point we are the community as well. Okay, we might not be from the village, or we might not be from within a 10-mile circumference, but we live here, our kids go to school here, we are part of the community, and I think that just takes a bit of time.
Maybe just to add another example for us, as I said, we work often in land that has been really very degraded. Some of the work we do is in Spain, where there's also a big rural abandonment phenomenon that took place. So we work with some municipalities where really there's not that many people left in the village, and the landscape around is also quite degraded. So these municipalities, these mayors, they also really have this hope, right, that to bring back nature into this land will also bring people back, right? Because once we start to have a nice forest on this large municipal land, there might be some tourism, right? There might be some farms around. So it's also, I think, that hope for the future that it will bring also people back, and we will find ways to work to be well together between nature and people on the land.
Well, what a great note to end our conversation on. I think I'm hearing a lot of, yes, there's challenges, there's a lot of nuances, there's also a lot of lessons learned, and it sounds like real opportunities for thoughtful engagement and thoughtful investment in this space. So if you just join me in thanking our panelists today, and I hope we continue the discussions later.